The air in the Tactical Operations Center was a stale mix of burnt coffee, ozone, and wet wool. It clung to the back of the throat, a taste of prolonged tension. Outside, the wind howled a thin, serrated song against the corrugated steel walls of Forward Operating Base Erebus. Perched at 9,000 feet in the jagged spine of a mountain range that had chewed up empires for millennia, Erebus was less a base and more a blister on the frozen skin of the world. It was Christmas Eve. The irony was lost on no one. Colonel Madsen stood before the main holo display, his posture a rigid line of frustration. The screen showed a grainy thermographic image of a stone compound clinging to a cliff face across a 2-kilometer chasm. A single, pulsing heat signature was their focus. Codename, the Engineer, a bomb maker whose handiwork had claimed 36 coalition lives in the past 4 months. Status, Thorne? Madsen's voice was gravelly, worn thin by the altitude and impatience. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, leader of the deployed SEAL team, stood with his arms crossed. His frame seemed to fill the cramped space, all coiled muscle and quiet, predatory confidence. No change, Colonel. Wind is still a variable nightmare, gusting from 270 at the nest, but God knows what it's doing in the gorge. Riptide says it's like shooting through a blender. Beside him, Riptide, the team's primary sniper, grunted in agreement. He was younger than Thorne, with a brash energy that bordered on arrogance. It's not just variable, sir. It's schizophrenic, pushing left, then dropping, then doubling back. The air density is a joke up here. My dope card is useless. He had missed 3 shots in the last hour, each one a clean miss that sent the target scrambling back into the depths of the compound. The window was closing. Madsen's jaw tightened. He glanced over at the woman standing near the door, separate from the tight knot of SEALs. She hadn't spoken a word since she'd arrived on the last chopper from Bagram, a last-minute addition to the mission roster that he had neither requested nor wanted. Master Sergeant Anya Sharma. Her file was thin, listing her as a senior instructor from the Army Marksmanship Unit at Fort Benning, a teacher. She was of average height, with a lean, wiry build that seemed almost fragile next to the hulking operators. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, and her face was a study in stillness, her dark eyes taking in everything without comment. She held no weapon, only a long, heavy-looking hard case that she had refused to let the quartermaster handle. "And you are?" Madsen had asked her upon arrival, his tone clipped with undisguised annoyance. "Master Sergeant Sharma, sir," she had replied, her voice quiet but clear, with no hint of subservience or apology. "And you're here to do what exactly, Master Sergeant?" "Observe, sir, as ordered." Madsen had snorted. Observe! He didn't need observers. He needed a miracle. He turned his attention back to the SEALs. "Thorne, we are out of time. Intel says he's bugging out at dawn. If he walks, he takes the plans for his new toy with him. That cannot happen." "We know the stakes, Colonel," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. "Riptide's the best there is. If he can't make the shot, nobody can." It was then that Sharma took a half step forward. The movement was small, but in the tense, static room, it was like a thunderclap. Every eye turned to her. The SEALs sized her up with open disdain. She wasn't one of them. She was Army, and worse, a woman who looked more like a librarian than an operator. "The wind isn't the only problem, Lieutenant Commander," she said, her voice still quiet, yet it cut through the low hum of the servers. Riptide scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "Oh, here we go. The instructor's got a theory." He looked her up and down. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't a 1,000-yard range at Benning with little flags telling you which way the breeze is blowing." Sharma's expression didn't change. She met his condescending gaze without flinching. "I'm aware of that. You're compensating for windage and elevation, but you're not accounting for the vertical shear or the terminal updraft. The gorge acts as a funnel. The wind isn't just moving left and right. It's rolling. Your rounds are sailing over his head because the air's lifting them in the final 200 meters. A heavy silence descended on the talk. Thorne stared at her, a flicker of something, annoyance, curiosity, in his eyes. Madsen just looked tired. "And you gleaned this tactical masterpiece from standing by the door?" Riptide sneered. "I gleaned it from the vapor trails of your missed shots on the thermal feed," Sharma corrected him calmly. And from the way the snow is scouring the rock face on the far side, it's moving up, not across. Madsen rubbed the bridge of his nose. This was devolving into a pointless academic debate while a high-value target was preparing to vanish. Thorn, get your man ready for another attempt. We have a 30-minute window before we scrub. Yes, sir. Thorn shot a warning look at Riptide, who fell silent, though his contempt was still written all over his face. He turned to leave, the rest of his team falling in behind him. As they passed Sharma, one of them, a medic they called Doc, gave her a look that was more pity than scorn. She was an outsider, and she had just embarrassed their best shot in front of the CO. It was a cardinal sin in their tightly knit world. Sharma remained where she was, a solitary figure in the humming, claustrophobic room. She watched the screen, her gaze distant, as if she were seeing not just the pixelated image, but the valley itself, the currents of air, the weight of the cold, the subtle physics of a Charu world operating at the edge of human endurance. Madsen ignored her, focusing his entire being on the mission, on the men he trusted. He didn't have time for theories from a range instructor. He had a war to fight. The dismissal was absolute, a wall of institutional arrogance and battlefield pragmatism. She was a ghost in the room, her expertise unheard, her presence an inconvenience. The sniper's nest was a cramped dugout carved into the ridge, shielded from the relentless wind by a camouflage screen crusted with ice. Inside, the temperature was a brutal 20 below zero. Riptide lay prone behind his Mk-13 rifle, the carbon fiber stock cold enough to steal the heat from his bones through his gloves. Doc lay beside him, spotting scope pressed to his eye. No movement, Doc murmured, his breath pluming in a thick white cloud. He's spooked. He'll be back, Riptide grunted, his eye glued to his optic. He can't resist checking his handiwork. He's arrogant. The irony of the statement was lost on him. He was shivering, not just from the cold, but from the frustration of his failures. He was a SEAL. He didn't miss, yet he had 3 times. The instructor's words echoed in his head, an infuriating little burr under his skin. The air's lifting them. He'd dismissed it as nonsense, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Was it possible? He'd spent his life mastering this craft. He knew ballistics, knew the intricate dance of gravity and wind. He could read mirage like a book, calculate spindrift in his sleep. But this place was different. The air was thin and sharp, the wind a malevolent entity with a mind of its own. It didn't follow the rules. Talk to me, Doc, he said, his voice tight. Wind is holding steady at the 10 o'clock, maybe 7 miles per hour, Doc reported, his voice flat with professionalism. But I see what she meant. Look at the powder snow on the lower third of the target cliff. It's swirling up, like steam from a kettle. Riptide didn't answer. He adjusted the windage knob on his scope, adding a few clicks, then took a few more off. He was guessing now, chasing a ghost. His confidence, once an impenetrable shield, was cracked. The pressure from Madsen, from Thorn, from his own pride, was a physical weight on his back. Back in the talk, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a knife. Colonel Madsen paced a short, worn track in the plywood floor. Every few seconds, his eyes would dart to the screen, then to the clock. 22 minutes left in the window. Sharma had moved from the door to a vacant analyst station. She had brought up a topographical map of the valley, overlaid with meteorological data from a microdrone they had sent up earlier. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with quiet efficiency, cross-referencing temperature gradients, barometric pressure, and humidity. The SEALs, when they'd bothered to look at the data, had seen chaos. She was looking for a pattern. Thorn stood behind her, watching over her shoulder. He hadn't intended to. He had walked over to get another cup of coffee, but her focus, her utter absorption in the data, had arrested him. She wasn't just looking at numbers. She was dissecting the very anatomy of the environment. It's a Venturi effect, she said, so quietly he wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to herself. The gorge narrows about halfway across, and the base elevation drops suddenly. The wind is being compressed and then released, creating a low-pressure column that generates significant vertical lift on the far side. It's not just an updraft, it's a vortex. Thorn remained silent. He was a warrior, a leader of men, not a physicist. But he understood complex systems. He understood that a battlefield was more than just targets and trajectories. He was beginning to realize that they had fundamentally misread the problem. And, by extension, they had fundamentally misread the woman in front of him. Target! The voice of the drone operator crackled over the speakers. On the main screen, the heat signature reappeared. The engineer had stepped out onto a small balcony, holding a device that looked like a satellite phone. "He's making a call," Madsen snapped. "Riptide, you have the shot. Take it." The comms channel to the sniper nest crackled to life. "Copy, I have him." Riptide's voice was strained. "Wind is shifting. Damn it, holding for a lull." They all watched the screen, a collection of silent, tense shadows. The tiny glowing figure of the engineer was a fragile beacon in the vast, cold darkness. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity. "Come on, son, take the shot," Madsen whispered, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of a console. "I don't have a solution, sir." Riptide's voice was sharp with panic. "The wind is all over the place. I can't dope it." "Take the shot," Madsen roared. A moment later, the muffled crack of the rifle echoed faintly through the talk. They watched the screen, holding their collective breath. The vapor trail of the round was briefly visible on the thermal feed, a faint, streaking line. It started true then. In the last quarter of its flight, it bent upwards as if lifted by an invisible hand. It passed a full meter above the engineer's head, striking the rock harmlessly behind him. The target vanished instantly, swallowed by the stone of the compound. "Damn it all to hell!" Madsen slammed his fist on the console. The mission was a failure. Riptide's voice came over the comms, choked with fury and shame. "No joy. Target is gone. The wind, it's impossible." A funereal quiet settled over the room. The opportunity was lost. The engineer would walk and more people would die. The weight of the failure was suffocating. It was into this void that Sharma spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the density of a collapsing star. "Colonel," she said, turning from her console to face him, "it's not impossible." Madsen stared at her, his face a mask of weary disbelief. "Master Sergeant, in case you missed it, the best sniper in naval special warfare just said it's impossible. The mission is scrubbed." "With respect, sir," Sharma said, her gaze unwavering, "he's using the wrong tool, and he's reading the wrong signs." She gestured to the hard case that had been leaning against the wall by her feet. "Give me 10 minutes to set up, and I need one other thing." Madsen looked from her to Thorn, then back again. He was a man out of options, standing on the precipice of a major intelligence failure. Protocol, pride, prejudice, they were all luxuries he could no longer afford. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice flat. "The target isn't the man," Sharma said, her eyes fixed on the screen where the engineer had been. "He's a symptom. The disease is his ability to communicate, to coordinate. Intel briefs say he's using a custom-built burst transmission relay. It's hardened, but its power and data feeds are external. They run up the rock face to a small dish camouflaged above the balcony." She brought up a magnified schematic on her monitor. 10 thin fiber optic cables were highlighted, bundled together before entering the relay's main housing. "If he thinks we're trying to kill him, he'll stay hidden," she explained. "But he needs to talk to his network. He'll have to keep his relay online. Sever these 10 cables and you blind him. You cut him off completely. He's isolated, deaf and dumb. He can't trigger his cells. He can't send his data. You neutralize the threat without ever touching the man." Thorne stared at the schematic. The cables were hair-thin, bundled into a conduit no thicker than a man's thumb. Hitting a single one at this range, in these conditions, was absurd. Hitting 10 sequentially. It was fantasy. "That's surgically precise," Thorne breathed, the skepticism in his voice warring with a nascent sense of awe. "Yes," Sharma said simply. "You think you can hit those?" Madsen asked, his voice laced with the final dregs of doubt. "I don't think, Colonel," she replied, her gaze as cold and clear as the mountain air. "I know. The crisis had a new name. It wasn't the wind, or the distance, or the target. It was the sheer breathtaking audacity of her proposal. The mission had escalated from a difficult shot to a feat of marksmanship that bordered on the supernatural. And the woman proposing it was a ghost, an unknown quantity who had just quietly, calmly declared the impossible to be merely a matter of process. The journey to the secondary sniper's nest, a small exposed ledge 100 meters from the SEAL's position, was a battle in itself. The wind tore at Sharma, trying to rip the heavy rifle case from her grip. It was a physical assault, a constant shrieking pressure that sought out every seam in her cold-weather gear. She moved with a steady, deliberate economy of motion, her boots finding purchase on the ice-slicked rock as if she were born to it. Thorn had insisted on escorting her, a silent, looming presence at her back. He said nothing, merely watched. The nest was nothing more than a shallow depression in the rock, offering a slightly different angle on the target compound. It was more exposed, but Sharma had chosen it for a reason. "The crosswind is cleaner here," she had said in the talk. "Less turbulence from the ridgeline." She knelt and unlatched the case. The SEALs had mocked it. It was a behemoth, none of the sleek tactical black of their own gear. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was her rifle. It was not a standard-issue weapon. It was a custom-built bolt-action rifle, chambered in 408 Chaytak. The barrel was long and heavy, fluted to dissipate heat and reduce weight. The stock was a skeletonized chassis of machined aluminum, and the optic mounted on top was the size of a small telescope. It looked more like a piece of scientific instrumentation than a tool of war. Riptide and Doc watched from their own position through a spotting scope, their comms open on a private channel. "What the hell's that thing?" Riptide muttered. "Looks like she's planning to shoot down a satellite." "It's a Chaytak," Doc replied, a note of grudging respect in his voice. "They're built for extreme long range. Look at the size of that cartridge." Sharma worked with a focused, unhurried grace that was mesmerizing to watch. Every movement was precise, stripped of any wasted effort. She attached the bipod, seating its feet firmly on the rock. She mounted a small device to the scope, a Kestrel weather meter with an integrated ballistics calculator. She produced a single box of ammunition from her pack. The cartridges were huge, the long, lathe-turned copper bullets gleaming dully in the faint light from the moon. She laid 10 of them out beside her on a small cloth, each one a gleaming promise of violence. Thorn watched her, his initial skepticism having curdled into a profound and unsettling curiosity. He had seen hundreds of operators handle their weapons. For most, it was a job, a practiced skill. For some, it was a craft. For Sharma, it was something else entirely. It was a communion. Her hands moved over the rifle as if she were reading it, listening to it. She checked the torque heat on the scope rings, wiped a microscopic speck of dust from the objective lens, and cycled the bolt, the sound a slick metallic whisper that was swallowed by the wind. She lay down behind the rifle, settling her body into the rock, becoming a part of the mountain. She didn't fight the cold. She seemed to absorb it, to make it a part of her stillness. Through his own binoculars, Thorn could see her eyes. They were closed. Her breathing was slow, rhythmic. She wasn't preparing to shoot. She was preparing to wait. In the TOC, Madsen stood with his arms bolted across his chest, his gaze locked on the magnified image of the 10 fiber optic cables on the main screen. They were barely visible, a thin, dark line against the gray rock. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind over the open comms channel. "She's in position," Thorn's voice reported, low and steady. "She's waiting." Minutes stretched into an eternity. The wind howled and dropped, gusted and died. Nothing happened. "What is she waiting for?" Madsen demanded, his patience worn to a thread. "The lull between the exhale and the inhale," Thorn replied, the words coming to him unbidden. He didn't know what they meant, but they felt true. He was watching an artist prepare her canvas. Then, Sharma's eyes opened. She took a final reading from the Kestrel, her thumb making a minute adjustment on the elevation turret of her scope. Her cheek settled against the stock of the rifle, a perfect, repeatable weld. Her left hand curled under the buttstock, her fingers making tiny, almost imperceptible adjustments. Her voice came over the comms, calm and devoid of emotion. "Sending." The rifle's report was a deep, resonant boom, utterly different from the sharp crack of the SEAL's rifle. It was the sound of controlled power. In the talk, they watched the screen, their hearts in their throats. For nearly 3 seconds, nothing happened. The bullet was a ghost, traversing 2 kilometers of treacherous air. Then, on the screen, a tiny flicker. The topmost cable, cable 1, snapped. A shower of microscopic sparks bloomed and vanished as the fiber optic line was severed. "Hit," the drone operator said, his voice a choked whisper of disbelief. "Cable 1 is cut." A stunned silence fell over the talk. Madsen took an involuntary step closer to the screen. Riptide's voice came over the private channel, raw with shock. "No way, that's impossible. A fluke." Back on the ridge, Sharma had already cycled the bolt, ejecting the spent casing in a smooth, fluid motion and chambering a new round. Her eye had never left the scope. Her body was a statue of placid concentration. She was no longer just a soldier. She was an extension of the rifle, a human component in a system of impossible precision. She made another minuscule adjustment to her hold, shifting her point of aim a fraction of a millimeter. The wind was a living thing, and she was in dialogue with it. It told her its secrets, and she listened. "Sending," she said again. The rifle boomed. The 3-second wait, the flicker on the screen. "Hit! Cable 2 is severed." Riptide was speechless. This was no fluke. This was a demonstration. One by one, Sharma began to dismantle the engineer's world. Her process was a hypnotic ritual. The patient wait, the slight adjustment, the calm announcement, the deep boom of the rifle, the agonizing pause, the tiny spark of impact on the screen. "Sending. Boom. Wait. Spark. Hit. Cable 3 is severed." "Sending. Boom. Wait. Spark. Hit. Cable 4 is severed." With each successful shot, the tension in the taut coiled tighter. The initial shock gave way to a dawning, terrifying realization of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just good shooting. This was something else entirely. It defied the known limits of the art. She wasn't just hitting a target, she was performing a miracle, 10 times in a row. Thorne, lying on the rock near her, felt the shockwave of each shot reverberate through his bones. He watched her, not the target. He saw the absolute stillness of her body, the perfect control of her breathing. He saw the way her trigger finger moved, a slow, steady press so smooth it was impossible to tell the exact moment the sear would break. She was operating on a level of concentration he had never before witnessed. "Sending. Boom. Wait. Spark. Hit. Cable 5 is gone." "Sending. Boom. Wait. Spark. Cable 6 is cut." Halfway through, the wind kicked up, a sudden violent gust that sent a plume of snow swirling across the chasm. "Wind shift!" Doc called out over the comms from his position. "Major gust from the north." Sharma didn't react. She simply waited, her eyes still in the scope, her body still locked to the earth. She let the gust pass, feeling its power, measuring its duration. She waited for the air to settle back into its previous rhythm, a rhythm only she seemed to understand. "She's reading it," Thorne whispered into his mic. His words meant only for Madsen. "She's not fighting it, she's reading it." The lull came. "Sending. Boom. Wait. Spark. Hit. Cable 7. The men in the talk had stopped breathing. They were no longer soldiers watching a mission unfold. They were spectators at an event that would be told in hushed tones for years to come. They were witnessing the birth of a legend. Sending. Boom. Wait. Spark. Cable 8. On the screen, they could see the remaining 2 cables whipping in the wind, their connection to the relay now tenuous. The target was almost completely isolated. Riptide, in his nest, had lowered his rifle. He was just watching now, through his scope, his own failure a bitter taste in his mouth. But the bitterness was being replaced by something else, a profound, humbling, and deeply unsettling sense of respect. He had called her an instructor. He had been wrong. She was a master. Sharma took a slow, deep breath. 2 shots left. The cold was a physical pain now, a deep ache in her joints. The strain of maintaining such intense focus was immense, but her face remained a mask of serene calm. Sending. Boom. Wait. Spark. Cable 9 is severed. 1 left. The final thin strand connecting the engineer to his network. The entire mission, the lives of dozens, perhaps hundreds, rested on this single final shot. Sharma closed her eyes for a brief second. She pictured the bullet's flight, the arc through the thin air, the kiss of the wind, the final decisive impact. She opened them. The world was sharp, clear, reduced to the crosshairs and the target. Her voice, for the last time, was a whisper on the wind. Sending. The final boom echoed across the frozen valley. The 3 seconds of silence were the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. Then, on the screen, the last cable snapped. The relay box, its connection severed, sputtered. A small blue electrical arc flashed, and then the entire device went dark. The drone operator's voice was hoarse. "Target is dark. I repeat, the relay is completely offline. Mission accomplished." A wave of relief, so powerful it was almost sickening, washed through the talk. Men clapped each other on the back. A few let out ragged whoops of victory. Madsen sank into a chair, the tension draining from him, leaving him feeling hollowed out and ancient. He looked at the screen, at the dark, inert box, and then at the tactical display showing Sharma's position. His mind was reeling. He had dismissed her. They had all dismissed her. They had looked at her and seen a checkbox, a token, an instructor far from her sterile, predictable firing range. They had seen anything but the truth. "Thorn," Madsen said into his mic, his voice rough with emotion, "who the hell is she?" There was a pause on the other end. Thorn's voice, when it came, was filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. "I'm looking at her file again, sir. It's mostly redacted, black lines everywhere. But there's one thing, an old call sign, buried in an operational annex from the Asadabad campaign 10 years ago. An older intelligence warrant officer, who had been silently monitoring comms in the corner, looked up from his console, his eyes wide. He knew the stories, the whispers that circulated in the shadows of the intelligence community. "What's the call sign, Lieutenant Commander?" Madsen demanded. Thorn took a breath. "Kismet, sir." The warrant officer stood up, pushing his chair back. He walked over to the main console, staring at the screen as if seeing a ghost. "Kismet," he breathed, the name an incantation. "It can't be. That's a legend, a ghost story they tell new snipers at Hereford and Bragg. They said Kismet was a shadow in the Hindu Kush, a whisper on the wind. They said she made a shot in a sandstorm that people still say was impossible, taking out a command and control vehicle's antenna from over 2.5 kilometers away. They said she could thread a needle in a hurricane." He looked at Madsen, his face pale. "We thought it was just a myth, sir, a boogeyman to scare insurgents. We never thought Kismet was real." Madsen stared at the screen, the pieces clicking into place. The unassuming demeanor, the quiet confidence, the impossible skill. It wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. The certainty of a master who had long ago transcended the need for validation. He had had a living legend on his base, and he had treated her like a novice. The shame was a cold, heavy weight in his gut. On the ridge the action was over, but the moment hung in the air, thick and crystalline. Thorn slowly rose to his feet and walked the few meters to where Sharma was already beginning to break down her rifle. She moved with the same deliberate, unhurried grace she had shown in setting it up. The 10 spent brass casings lay in a neat, shining row on the rock beside her. She didn't look up as he approached. He stopped a few feet away, the wind whipping at his uniform. He wanted to say something, to apologize for their arrogance, to express the sheer, mind-bending awe he felt. But the words felt cheap, inadequate. They were the currency of a world she didn't seem to inhabit. Instead, he simply stood there as she carefully wiped down the barrel, cleaned the bolt, and laid the rifle back in its foam cradle. He watched as she gathered the 10 spent casings, her fingers moving gently over the warm brass before placing them in a small pouch. They were not trophies, they were records, a testament to a job completed. From the other nest, Riptide and Doc appeared, moving slowly, hesitantly. They stopped near Thorn, their faces etched with a mixture of shame and wonder. Riptide, the brash, cocky seal, looked like a chastened child. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at Sharma, who was now closing the latches on her rifle case. She finally looked up, her gaze sweeping over the 3 of them. There was no triumph in her eyes, no, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, profound weariness. She had done what she had come to do. Thorn unclipped a large, insulated thermos from his belt. He unscrewed the cap and poured a cup of steaming black coffee. He held it out to her. "Master Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet. Sharma looked at the cup, then at his face. She saw the apology he couldn't speak, the respect he couldn't articulate. She reached out and took the cup, her gloved fingers brushing against his. She held it in both hands, letting the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. She gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. The gesture was a bridge across the chasm of rank, of service branch, of pride. It was a silent acknowledgement of her mastery. The mockery was gone, incinerated by the fire of her competence. In its place was a quiet, solemn respect that was more powerful than any medal or citation. Riptide finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. "How?" he asked. "How did you know what the wind was going to do?" Sharma took a slow sip of the coffee, her gaze drifting out over the vast, dark valley. The first hints of dawn were beginning to stain the eastern horizon, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of violet and rose. "You don't fight the mountain," she said, her voice soft, almost carried away by the wind. "You don't force it to do what you want. You have to listen to it. You feel its breath, learn its rhythms. You become a part of its stillness. Only then will it tell you the truth." She finished the coffee, handed the empty cup back to Thorne, and shouldered her heavy case. Without another word, she turned and began the long walk back to the main compound, a solitary figure silhouetted against the coming dawn. The three seals watched her go, silent monuments to their own humbled pride, standing sentinel on the frozen roof of the world. Later, as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snow, the talk was quiet. The frantic energy of the night had dissipated, replaced by a contemplative stillness. The mission reports were filed, the commendations written, but the official record would never capture the reality of what had happened. Colonel Madsen sat alone in his office, staring at Sharma's redacted file on his screen. Kismet. He closed the file, leaned back in his chair, and looked out his small window at the brutal beauty of the mountains. He had been given a lesson not just in marksmanship, but in leadership, in humility. He had almost allowed his own prejudice to scrub a vital mission. He had mistaken quiet for weakness and stillness for inaction. He would not make that mistake again. The SEAL team kept to themselves for the rest of the day. The usual boisterous energy in their corner of the mess hall was absent. They ate in silence, the events of the previous night replaying in their minds. Riptide didn't touch his food. He just stared at his hands, the hands that had failed where hers had succeeded. He was reevaluating everything he thought he knew about his craft, about the nature of excellence. He had climbed to the top of his own mountain, only to find that there was a higher peak, one he hadn't even known existed. That evening, Christmas Day, a fragile quiet descended over Fob Erebus. The wind had finally died down, and the silence it left behind was vast and profound. A makeshift Christmas dinner was being served in the mess, a small pocket of forced cheer in a place defined by its absence. Master Sergeant Sharma was not there. She was in a small, windowless maintenance room, the armorer's workshop. She had her rifle completely disassembled on a long workbench. The pieces were laid out on a clean cloth in perfect order, a collection of precisely machined steel and carbon fiber. She was cleaning it. The ritual was slow, meticulous. She used small brushes and clean patches, her movements economical and practiced. Each part was inspected, wiped down, and lightly oiled. For her, this was not a chore. It was a rite. It was how she centered herself, how she processed the violent, precise work she was called upon to do. The rifle was not just a tool, it was a partner. It demanded respect, care, and an intimate understanding of its nature. It was an extension of her own will, and she honored it as such. The door to the workshop creaked open. Sharma didn't look up, but her hands paused in their work. It was Thorne. He stood in the doorway, holding 2 plates from the mess hall. He said nothing, simply walked over and placed one on the empty end of the workbench. It was a slice of dry turkey, a scoop of instant mashed potatoes, and a dollop of canned cranberry sauce. A soldier's Christmas. He took the other plate and sat on a nearby stool, eating in silence. The only sounds were the soft click of his fork against the plate and the gentle rasp of Sharma's cleaning brush on steel. It was an odd, unspoken truce. He was not intruding, merely sharing the space, offering a quiet companionship that asked for nothing in return. After a few minutes, another figure appeared in the doorway. It was Riptide. He held something in his hand. He looked awkward, out of place. He walked over to the workbench, avoiding Sharma's gaze, and placed a small object next to her disassembled rifle. It was a challenge coin, the trident of the Navy SEALs. He laid it down flat, the golden insignia gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light. Then, without a word, he turned and left. The coin was the ultimate sign of respect between warriors. It was an apology, an acknowledgement, and an acceptance of her into their rarefied world, not as a guest, but as a peer. No, as a master. Sharma stopped her work. She looked at the coin, then at Thorn. He met her gaze and gave a small, slow nod. He finished his meal, stood up, and took his empty plate. "Merry Christmas, Master Sergeant," he said quietly, and then he too was gone. Sharma was alone again with her rifle. She looked at the challenge coin for a long moment. Then she picked it up, its weight solid and cool in her palm. She didn't smile, but the hard lines around her eyes seemed to soften just for a moment. She slipped the coin into her pocket and returned to her work, her hands moving with the same steady, quiet grace as before. The sun had set, and the deep, star-dusted night of the high mountains had reclaimed the world. The war would continue. There would be other missions, other targets. But something had shifted on Afab Erebus. A legend had walked among them, and the memory of her 10 perfect shots on Christmas Eve would be etched into the soul of every person who had witnessed it. Respect had been earned not with words, but with an act of impossible, undeniable skill. It was a quiet, symbolic closure, written in spent brass and a silent offering of a soldier's meal under the watchful gaze of the silent, eternal mountains.